fair for that. And so a very warm welcome again to the latest in the School of Geography and Environmental Sciences, Mark Blacksell Lecture Series. And it's really lovely to see you here tonight. And in particular pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Professor Anna Davies, who's kindly made quite a substantial journey over from Trinity College in Dublin to help celebrate Mark's life and his work, and to share insights from her own research on the governance of environmental issues. Anna's talk is particularly fitting because amongst Mark's many and quite varied research interests was a sustained and often highly passionate and practical concern for conservation, planning in rural and wilderness landscapes, and about environmental governance issues more generally. But Mark was also actually my Director of Studies during the course of my PhD, and that experience really involved a great number of vibrant, insightful, and often no-nonsense discussions about how environmental issues are governed in various countries, the United Kingdom, Germany, and across the European Union. So a real contribution to that area, or to put it in a slightly less respectful way, or slightly more irreverent way, a great deal of what little I know about environmental governance issues I owe to Mark. But on to tonight's speaker, Anna. Just to give you a little flavour, many of you have already seen the flyers. Anna started her research career at Oxford Brookes University. Sorry?
Cambridge.
Oh, no, well, before moving on to Cambridge, was it, for your PhD?
No, undergraduate was Cambridge.
Oh, well, there you go. This is all Here's a confession time. Well, all I will say, Anna, is that I've been looking at your personal web pages over the course of the last 24 hours, and you may need to check some of that information. So, let's see if we can move on to firmer ground, shall we? So her research falls into the general field of environmental governance, but what distinguishes it as much as anything else is the diversity and depth of engagement with a range of these environmental governance issues, from environmental awareness through to waste management, biodiversity, climate change and sustainable development. And it's been a very profound engagement. So something like 16 major research projects that you've been involved with or led, spanning all those various fields. A current major project is called Share City, and it's funded by the European Research Council, and Anna's actually nodding at this point, so I'm doing rather better than I was earlier on in proceedings, examining practices, governance and impacts of city-based food-sharing economies from 7 cities around the world, all the way from the USA via Brazil and Germany through to Australia. And in terms of leadership, the list goes on and on of Anna's various leadership capacities, advising the Irish government, but culminating, I won't go through the whole litany for you, but culminating in 2013 in the Geographical Society of Ireland Award for Services to Society, Community and Environment. And in 2015, Anna was awarded a personal chair at Trinity College in Geography, Environment and Society. Now you'll see from the slide that the theme of Anna's talk is common ground, geography and everyday environments. And I'll leave Anna to elaborate all the detail behind all of that. And I'm sure this is maybe not be quite what Anna's going to be talking about in a few moments' time, but it does strike me that in a world that seems to be hell-bent on polarization at the present point in time, that the idea of exploring and creating common grounds is an inherently and massively appealing and worthwhile endeavour. So without further delays, I'd just like to say thank you again, Anna, for joining us this evening, and Professor Anna Davies.
Thank you, Ian, and thanks for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I'm just going to open up my presentation. Delighted to be here, and I'm really pleased that it actually resonates with some of the issues that Mark Blacksell was interested in himself. So I'm delighted to be here and very honoured to speak as part of that series. I'm also pleased to be able to talk in front of my family, which is a rare pleasure. My brother, sister-in-law, and my 2 nieces are here. They live locally, and so I don't think I've ever lectured to them, but you're very welcome. And I understand that my brother taught some of the people here in school geography. My brother's a geography teacher in the region, so it's very, very nice to be here. And under the title of Common Ground, I'm going to talk about two persistent themes in my research for the past 20 years. The importance of everyday places and practices in shaping us and the world around us, but also the importance of working together, particularly to meet these sustainability goals. We have now the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals set by the United Nations, and in order to achieve those, it's imperative that we find common ground, both physically and metaphorically. So my central argument today is going to be that we treat common ground as unimportant or unproblematic at our peril, and that geography has a central role to play in both understanding common ground and in helping to build common ground to meet sustainable development goals moving forward. What do I mean by common ground exactly? I often think it's useful to start with dictionary definitions. I think it was Dennis Potter who once said the problem with words is you don't know whose mouths they've been in. And I think it's worth to start looking at some of these issues. And I think this does encapsulate really how I'm going to approach this lecture around common ground. So initially we have common, often seen as kind of denigrating in some way, low class, usual or shared, a kind of attribute. In terms of ground, is much more material, tangible quality around land, soil and place. But together I suggest that these form common everyday environments, homes, gardens, parks, wastelands and cities. And also together they form a relational space where people can come together to find areas of agreement amongst possible disagreement, which in relation to society-environment interactions is very much part and parcel of the wicked problems that we face in society today. And by wicked problems I mean problems which we don't really even agree what the problems are, never mind establishing agreement over some of the solutions. So I'm going to begin first with the notion of common as low class. I don't know if you know, these are pictures of starlings produced by a fabulous artist called Anita Gwynn. You check out her website. She said I could use this picture if I publicised her blog site where she posts some of her glorious pictures of the everyday, so garden birds, garden plants and the like. But I think it's particularly useful when we think about the common ground as being low class or not very much value. I think perhaps it's important to state here that some of our most familiar common species, such as starlings, which are shown in this picture, are actually in marked decline across Europe. So starlings in the UK have declined by more than 50% since the 1970s. So they're not as common, as widespread or abundant as they have been in the past. Secondly, within any taxonomically defined assemblage, plants, bees, amphibians, birds, the state of being common, widespread and abundant, is actually quite rare. There are few species which are common, but there are many of them. It's also the case to suggest from research that common species, those are which are abundant and widespread, contribute significantly to the state of the ecosystem goods and services that provide us with everything that we eat, many of the materials that we use around us. So they're very familiar in terms of supporting services, soil formation, primary production, nutrient and water cycling, and also regulating services, air quality regulation, pollination, and things like that. But there's also growing evidence that the physical and visual encounters with the natural world positively influence human health and well-being, promoting recovery, aiding learning, even reducing crime. And noticeably in urban areas, where access to non-human nature is limited, but where most people live. And inevitably, it's the species which are common within cities, so the common species, that are chiefly responsible for these interactions in everyday environments. So the first two of those key concerns are really for the biologists and ecologists among you. But the third one, the value of everyday spaces, has been an enduring interest of mine over the last 20 years. The notion of valuing the environment and the processes by which we attribute values to the environment around us is something which has a long history in environmentalism. But in the 21st century, there's an increasing tendency to put an economic value on the nature around us through the notion of natural capital. That is making nature's value visible through natural capital accounting and even putting a price on those values which we attribute to it. Take this pint of Guinness, for example. Nature provides services that enable its production. So it has a certain number of limited ingredients. Does anybody know what goes up into making a pint of Guinness?
Water.
Water.
Hops.
I'm looking at you, Richard. You have an inflatable Guinness in your office, I noticed earlier.
Yeast.
It's water, barley, hops. Yeast, exactly. But of course, there's much more to it than those commodities, those substances, those materials. There's a whole suite of ecosystem services that around those four ingredients which provide and enable that pint to be made. And this is an interesting picture that was produced by the Irish Natural Capital Forum to illustrate some of those issues around the values which are invisible in our everyday environments. So here it's saying we have to take account of the rain that falls on the bogs in Ireland, which purify the water mechanically, chemically and biologically. The water flows through the rocks deep underground, picking up unique water chemistry into the rivers where it's extracted and processed to make beer to give that very distinctive flavour. Biodiversity, like the Research and Development Department for Nature, produces the genetic variety in terms of the hops to give it that particular flavour as well, and species diversity in relation to strains of yeast. Wetlands and woodlands provide the environment through which the barley can grow through its climate regulatory activities. So it's been suggested by the Irish Natural Capital Forum that actually the natural capital services create more than €2.6 billion to the economy every year. But what's particularly interesting for me as a geographer is the notion of scale within this. And I think these two slides are interesting from that regard. So this is the World Forum on Natural Capital, produced in 2003, and it's reframing some of those ideas. So seeing the trees for the wood rather than seeing the wood for the trees. And the problem, they say, is that when we start by focusing on wood, we look at the timber and we look at the wood fuel or employment, and we come up with what it's valuable, what wood is worth. But actually, what we're missing are all those broader categories and qualities which we get from trees as a more of an ecosystem service. And if we look at that, then we see that the monetary value is much larger. So the argument is here, you can't see some of these services, we need to put a price on it, therefore we will be able to... Okay, everyone ready? Apparently this is being recorded, so there'll be a kind of a gap in the middle. But I was always told in terms of lectures that people generally have an attention span of 10 minutes. Now that may even be less now because of mobile phones and how that's affecting our attention. But apparently after 10 minutes you're supposed to get people to stand up and do some stretching and everything. So hopefully we had a bit of fresh air and we can get back into it. So I was just talking about how geography has been really important in assisting in reframing some environmental challenges, particularly around valuing common ground or everyday landscapes. But there's been some problems, or there are some challenges of using a kind of very economistic framing for valuing the environment. It captures certain things for sure in terms of making tangible qualities such as pollination, and I think that that's really important. But reducing environments to a particularly monetary value to be traded for money has problems in terms of capturing those intangible qualities or those senses, those very visceral or emotional reactions that you get in terms of being surrounded by non-human nature. And so this is the kind of concept that we need to go beyond economic value and economic valuations of common ground in order to really establish the difference it makes to people's everyday lives. As William Bruce William Bruce Cameron noted back in the 1960s, was a sociologist, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And I think this diagram here, which is taken from the Living Planet Index, which only was published for 2016 in the last month, that there are a whole bunch of ecosystem services which are perhaps more cultural information around spiritual, religious values, aesthetic values, recreation, ecotourism, mental and physical well-being, which is simply very, very difficult to capture in terms of monetary valuation. And here's a quote which is taken from my PhD research back in the 1990s from an organisation called Common Ground, which was established in 1986 as a kind of arts environmental charity. And I was interviewing them in relation to this notion of what does the environment mean to you? What is the value for everyday environments? And I think this quote really sums up some of the difficulties of trying to put a monetary value on all of those things that we value in the environment around us. So they said it's all about the very ordinary things that make everyday life worth living, things which cross over between nature and history. But the intangibles have been ever more marginalised by professionals of all kinds, not because they're soft, which is what the media often call them, but because they're actually very hard to articulate, very hard to capture, and that's the paradox of all this. Their elusiveness is part of their importance. But what Common Ground have attempted to do is find ways to reconnect populations with their environments. It was staggering. I came across a statistic that indicated, and it was based in the United States, that in common society people spend 90% of their life indoors. And this has changed from 90% outdoors only a few hundred years ago. And that's a dramatic change. We're effectively caging ourselves like zoo animals. And I think the importance of reconnecting to outside non-human nature is incredibly important for psychological well-being. And this is what Common Ground have been trying to do through very action-oriented, very visual-driven initiatives. And here are just a few slides which illustrate some of those activities that they do. The top two are related to a project around local distinctiveness and particularly around parish mapping, where they use a participatory approach to build with communities collective ideas and visions around what's important to them in their local area. And this, of course, was framed in the 1990s very much around Local Agenda 21, which had similar kinds of drives both for participation, getting people involved, but also around trying to find ways for getting people to articulate things which are important to them. I often thought it was this other initiative called Seasonal Schools seeks experiential learning, and by that I mean going out into the field. And as geographers and as geography teachers, this is something that we hold very dear. Increasingly threatened through things such as insurance and liability and concerns and finance and funding for field trips, but field work, even if it is literally in the field outside the building, is incredibly important to how we experience the world around us. And I put in this final slide around Exeter Tree Tale just because of the proximate nature of Exeter to Plymouth and the idea that the Common Ground has these initiatives in the local area around trying to identify the importance of trees for local communities, mapping with them the history, the livelihoods, the life stories and biographies of these natural species, but which contribute to people's sense of place. But the problem is, it's one thing identifying what's valuable, it's another thing for that to be incorporated or considered in decision making. And we have this formal process in Ireland and also in the UK around land use planning, and there are very formal strictures around how we might participate. This has long been an issue and concern for many, either that it takes too long or it doesn't protect the things that we value. I thought it was very interesting. This is an extract from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I don't know if anybody's read it here, but if you haven't, I would highly recommend it. I think a film has come out recently, but of course originally it was a radio play. Now, part of the central storyline at the beginning of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is the Earth is going to be blown up to make way for an intergalactic superhighway. And this has been tasked by the Vogons to come in, who are the bureaucratic class, if you like, of the international space environment. And they're coming in to talk to a lot of these issues around planning and around what we might do. So here we have Jeltz, through the speakers, talking to the people of Earth. And then suggesting, well, there's no point in being surprised about it. The plans and demolition orders have been on display at your local planning office in Alpha Centauri for 50 of your Earth years. So you've had plenty of time to lodge formal complaints. What do you mean you've never been to Alpha Centauri? For heaven's sake, mankind, it's only 4 light years away, you know. I'm sorry, but if you can't be bothered to take an interest in local affairs, that's your own lookout. Apathetic bloody planet, I have no sympathy for you at all. Of course, this satirical framing around place, around planning, around the use of technology is still very relevant today. It's often felt that because people don't participate in formal planning, they don't care about it. But often the planning environment is often very adversarial. It admits certain types of values, particularly those which are tangible, particularly those which are quantifiable. These kinds of soft or very hard values as common ground we talk about, the intangible qualities are very, very difficult to incorporate in formal planning processes. And this was recognised back in the 1990s by the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, and I think that their final point in a report still holds true today, both in the UK and in Ireland, that we need desperately to find better ways for articulating people's values, but also taking them into account. It's simply not enough to have initiatives like Common Ground, which allow people to articulate what's important to them, if they're not taken seriously in terms of making decisions. So, in terms of some research I've been doing more recently, we've been looking at ways in which we can actively involve people in their everyday environments. And this project consensus about consumption, environment, and sustainability was particularly focused on the household, an everyday site of consumption. In fact, households contribute more than 60% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. They're sites of intense consumption, and some of these things in relation to unsustainable consumption. In this project, which was a 7-year programme which spanned a whole range of different areas from eating, washing, heating to moving, looked at the ways in which we might envision a more sustainable future, a more sustainable household consumption. What I'm going to focus on today is looking at the process of sustainable eating in the home. And this is important, I think, because it's important to recognise that there are currently abominable geographies around hunger and food waste. Some of these infographics indicate that 1 in 8 people go hungry in the world, while we have 500 million people who suffer from obesity. Now, while the hunger is predominantly concentrated in lower income countries, it's clear that there are major issues to be faced both in the UK and in Ireland. I understand that in 2016, the Trussell Trust, which is a coordination of food banks, has given out more food parcels than ever before. It's estimated that more than 8 million people in Britain live in households that still struggle to put enough food on the table. And 50% of that, so around about 4 million of these, regularly go a whole day without eating. The problem is this is an estimation because there's not really any precise data on food insecurity, nor indeed on food waste. But it is clear that between 1/3 and 1/2 of all food produced is wasted, either in terms of production, in terms of loss of crops, or retail and consumption phase, where things are literally thrown into the ground. The nutrition transition, which we're experiencing globally, which is a movement towards Western-style diets, is also creating increased problems for resource consumption and pollution. But there's limited visibility, particularly around how we practice eating in the home. Very little is known about what goes on behind closed doors. And often our practices, what we do around eating, are locked into infrastructures, to the way our kitchens are designed, to the way we do our shopping, and to the way that we deal around eating together or not. What we tried to do in Consensus was to open that door, to go into people's homes and try and understand, one, what they would like to do from a sustainability perspective, what would make their ideal sustainable eating scenario, but also to try and work with them to try and work out ways of making their diets and the way that they eat more sustainable in the future. And this was called a participatory backcasting approach. And this diagram across the top indicates the various stages that we went through. As I say, bear in mind it was a 7-year programme. We went from a co-creation perspective, which was basically getting people together, multiple stakeholders from retailers, designers, public policy makers, scientists, futurists, which I didn't know existed, but there are a whole bunch of people who spend their time thinking about the future, and getting them to come together to co-create visions or scenarios of more sustainable eating practices, and we took the year 2050 as our point. The idea that taking a point far enough away in the distance to liberate you from the constraints of the present, but allowing some kind of link to that period, if not you directly, then to your children, a time frame through it which we can at least sense its proximity. So some of these pictures indicate exactly what we were trying to do, getting people to come together and visualise things. We came up, in terms of sustainable eating, with 3 scenarios, and these were slightly different in terms of their formation, around 3 different forms of high regulatory change, high technological change, which is indicated in this scenario, and high social change, so doing things very, very differently. So in this scenario, we found people imagined that we'd have intelligent fridges that would know what's going in, how long they would last, what should be used, providing meal plans and things like that. Green fast food, so retaining the idea that convenience is important, but actually thinking about how we do that in a healthy way rather than things which are laden with highly processed, high contents of fats and sugars and the like. And in particular, this notion of the smartphone, and just bear that in mind for later in my talk. The educated eating was about reconnecting people to their environment, so getting people more involved with the production of food. Increasingly, we're reliant on international globalised food systems, trying to relocalise some aspects of that. Not suggesting that everything has to be local, but thinking about how we can produce at least some of our diets, either in our backyards or in the community spaces, which allow people to come together to think through and to work through some of the social connections that food provides for us. Community eating was much more about how we socially value eating. Now, food is for sustenance, absolutely, we need it to survive, but it's more than food. It's how we build social relations, it's how we connect with people, family and friends, but often also in terms of eating together in broader environments. What we did from those scenarios was create some transition plans. So we identified short-term interventions which weren't simply technological, but also included regulatory scenarios and also norm-disrupting ideas about how to eat differently. Things which were prototypical, ideas which were close to market or niche products and ideas. And we worked very closely with a number of households to try and see, with our help, we've provided all of those devices, all of those ideas, all of those frames, to see what difference it would make to the way that they eat it, and also to get their feedback around how they felt about doing things differently, which things were difficult given their lifestyles, which things were most challenging in terms of redirecting their eating patterns onto more sustainable pathways. I don't have time to go into this in depth today, but this just illustrates how we did it. So we worked over 5 weeks, introducing each week different ideas around products, tools and technologies, different information and inspirational visits. So for example, here we had chefs that came in and worked with people who went through all of their cupboards and talked to them about how they could plan their meals differently, how they could jazz up the way that they create their meals, and to introduce new flavour ideas and to plan their eating events so that they reduce particularly food waste. But also identifying regulatory ideas around how people might in the future be required to think about their carbon footprint, for example, in terms of the food that they eat, or indeed the embodied water in the food products that they consume. So we went through this process, we worked very much in hand with the households, and I think this is an important point, because in terms of changing behaviour, the dominant practice in terms of policy regulation is often about providing information. So it's the mass media campaign, reduce food waste, do this, do that. But what we found was that this actually didn't resonate with people's everyday practices, and we needed to find ways that connected with their everyday needs. So in the Consensus Project, we reframed the problem. So rather than looking at food waste, the end of the stream impact, we looked upstream and we looked at what needs the eating fulfilled in different perspectives. So this is really what we did here. And what is incredibly important is the role of the researcher in this, who acted as an intermediary, who acted as an enabler, who provided the materials, the ideas, the visits, who coordinated. And this person was a very trusted cog in the wheel, or the ecosystem of the way that the home labs worked. And I think that's an important take-home message for policymakers in particular. This systems of trust, people having trust, and we know in current society where we are around expertise and trust, that these things are not to be taken for granted. They're incredibly fragile and things that need to be built and maintained over time. So one of the high-level take-home messages which were formulated from the home labs were that by combining and aligning these rules, tools, skills and understandings, you're much more likely to disrupt patterns of habitual behaviour which may be unsustainable. And by combining and aligning in this way, we can actually reconfigure the way that we do things, and after a certain time embed those more sustainable practices in people's everyday lives. What we found from a quantitative metric was that overall food waste on average reduced by 28%, which was much higher than some of the statistics which were found to be done from mass media campaigns and through the provision only of, say, technological supports through composters and the like. The remaining food waste in the experiment was 100% composted, but it wasn't without its challenges. For example, we used a prototypical electronic composter, which was predominantly designed for apartment dwelling, which was people who weren't able to have a compost heap in their back garden, for example. But this was hugely problematic. People didn't like the notion, one, on the idea of using electricity to create compost, even though the convenience of it meant that you could get compost in only a few hours. But people felt that there was a contradiction in terms of their consumption of resource use in that frame, and most people didn't like it. There were problems with the technology as well, so it didn't produce the kind of compost that people were happy with. They couldn't pass it on to people. People didn't trust that it was actually going to be a useful compost for their gardens or plants and flowers. So it wasn't that we were always successful, but what we did find out was what people felt about embedding some of these activities and practices into their everyday life. But most important of all was the trusted intermediary, who was pivotal in convincing people that it was important to just try some of these different ways of doing things. Well, what struck me from the research that we did was the way in which many people envisaged that in the future, a more sustainable future, there would be a lot more collective activities around the production of food, around the cooking of food, and around the consumption of food. Things which in Western societies have been on the decline around eating together, which of course traditionally has been focused around the family meal, but also in terms of households changing their structure, increasingly around the individualisation or the TV dinner approach has been problematic. So what I decided was to think through this notion of food sharing, if you like, and it was at a time when the sharing economy was hitting the media, so the Airbnb phenomenon, the Uberization of society, which was creating a lot of media attention to a commercial form of sharing, which was mediated through and driven and enabled through ICT, so information and communication technologies, particularly smart technologies around apps and those kinds of things, which connected people in ways which hadn't been physically possible previously. And while there had been increasing attention to this notion of sharing economies in accommodation, in the mobility sphere, there had been less attention to the food eating environment, which I thought was rather strange, given that food sharing is the bedrock of human civilization. It was what enabled us to develop societal structures, the division of labour, the idea that if you went out and farmed, someone else could be doing something else, that built tribal networks, that built the civilization as we know it. So it has long roots and a long lineage, but actually is being transformed through technology in terms of these ICT-mediated sharing events. So I conducted a scoping study to see if there were examples of food sharing, and I took a very broad understanding of food sharing, right from the production of sharing spaces to grow, cook or eat, the sharing of things and the sharing of stuff. So the sharing of food itself, but also perhaps the sharing of seeds or the sharing of compost, and the sharing of services or knowledge and skills around food sharing. And I was lucky enough, as Ian mentioned, to get ERC funding, which is like the holy grail for academics. It provides a 5-year funding stream. It allows you to build a team, so it allows you to attempt projects of scale over a long period of time, which it means that you can really address what are called sort of high risk, potentially high gain issues, or blue skies research. So things which are kind of not necessarily directly relevant to an impending problem, although I would argue that scarcity is, but things which enable people to go out into the unknown, if you like. And nobody had studied food sharing in this way previously. Nobody had looked beyond individual case studies of interesting examples to see if there was a more coherent landscape around food sharing, and to also question and interrogate whether some of the assumptions that this was more sustainable, that it is more sustainable to share food, were actually true. So to try and put some evidence behind some of the claims which are being made around social, economic and environmental benefits of food sharing. So where did I go? I was looking at ICT mediation, so that was kind of handy because I could do things online from my desk. So I produced a scoping study which indicated that it was truly a global phenomenon. So there are examples of food sharing across the globe. And this was enough for me to get some confidence, okay, we're going to go to the funders here and see if they would be interested in looking at some of these issues. What I found was that with the help of my team, we found more than 4,000 of these food sharing enterprises across 100 cities around the globe, across 6 continents. Now there is an interactive open access database that you can find from our website, which is sharecity.ie. And you can go in there and you can search by the cities, the 100 cities that we have, by what is shared. We have a whole bunch of icons which indicate we've dissected and collected food sharing, whether it's seeds, fruit stuff, meals, skills, etc. And you can also look at how it's shared. So the different models of sharing. Some of that is related to gifting, so when food is given for free, or where skills and information are given for free, or land is given for free to grow food. But it also can be bartering or swapping. So you give something, someone gives something back to you. We also incorporated the not-for-profit social enterprise model and the commercial or for-profit or for monetary exchange aspect of food sharing. This was particularly interesting because what we found was that while unsurprisingly where internet penetration is at its highest, we found most ICT-mediated activity, but that even places like Doha, even places like Porto Alegre in Brazil, these are places when Dakar, for example, they all have examples of ICT-mediated food sharing, where technology is used to connect people, to stretch the spaces over which food sharing can take place. So this was clearly a global phenomenon, if only at a kind of small scale. We searched using 23 languages to try and establish whether we were getting all the information about these activities. But what I'm going to talk to you today about is not the detail of that database, but to take out a particular case study to illustrate some of the issues that we're looking at. So these are the kind of high-level findings from the database. What you can see is that knowledge and skills are the highest proportion of things which are shared around food, particularly around cooking and growing. But what's important to remember is that these food sharing enterprises are multifunctional, which means they often do more than one thing. And they're hybrid, so they will look at knowledge and skills, but they will also share stuff. They might share spaces, but they will also share technologies. So it's not just one thing, they're hybrid organisations which use diverse economic frames and models. It's part of a whole body of research called diverse economies, which suggests that we should look at the multiple ways in which we function as a society, not just those which are for-profit or commercial or private sector. What you can see here is that gifting, so the giving of food for free, is still the largest activity, but followed by selling, so followed by the commercial aspects of food sharing. This is where you might wish to sell food that you have leftovers, for example, like cookisto, where you might bake a whole tray of lasagna, for example, you have a couple of portions left. You can go on an app and someone can say, I've got 2 portions of lasagna going for €5, come round here to my place and you can pick them up. That kind of activity. What we can see is the majority of the ICT engagement is around websites, and this indicates the increasing accessibility of some of these ICT or technological devices. The app approach, which is the most highly technological, is unsurprisingly at the lower end of the incidences here, because simply a lot of these organisations are grassroots. So they're enterprises which are from the bottom up. They're not large-scale organisations, they're micro-enterprises. So often lacking in the resources and skills and finance to be able to adopt some of these highly technological responses. What's particularly interesting from an environmental sustainability perspective is that a lot of these organisations claimed benefits, whether they were economic, social or environmental. 3/4 of all organisations claimed either economic or social benefits from the activities that they do, and this is from their websites. About 2/3 said that they had environmental benefits. But what struck us was it was very difficult to get behind those claims, to see exactly what kind of impact they're having and what kind of benefits they were generating. And this is why the database provided us with that landscape view, which created a visibility, it performed a visibility process for me in terms of food sharing. But in order to understand really what's going on and the benefits it creates, you have to go drill down and work on the ground with these individual enterprises. So what I'm going to talk to you today is a case study called Food Cloud. So I put in Dublin in the case study, pulled out food and looked at gifting and identified 11 enterprises in Dublin that use those particular models to exchange food. And Food Cloud down the bottom here is a social enterprise. I know it very well because it was a start-up organisation from Trinity College Dublin. So I had a master's student who was working with me to get masters on environmental science, and she was very interested in this area of food waste and particularly surplus food redistribution. And what was clear from a feasibility study that she conducted for her dissertation in environmental science was that there was a lack of infrastructure in Ireland to provide a national framework for redistributing surplus food. And her idea was to create that platform using an app, so using technology. And she hooked up with a business studies student, two business studies students, initially to set up this startup company called Food Cloud in 2012. They worked with a whole bunch of local retailers, with local charities to test their idea, to conduct a kind of proof of concept notion of whether there was a demand out there for redistributing surplus food. By 2014, they had trials with large retailers, and they've been working trying to get Tesco's, which is a big supermarket chain in Ireland as well as in the UK, to get them on board to see if they would roll out their activities. After more than 6 months of negotiations, I think helped by the fact that at that time Tesco was having quite considerable bad press around its practices in terms of accounting, in terms of its profit forecasts and the like, they felt that they needed some good news story. So they worked with Food Cloud to roll out this process of redistributing surplus food across 146 shops within Tesco stores within Ireland. By 2015, they'd established what I'd call an ecosystem network of support organisations. So they were working with this organisation, a social enterprise called Falling Fruit, which was about gleaning surplus urban food harvests. So when you see lots of blackberries which are unpicked or lots of apples which are unpicked, this organisation collects those for the owners of the land, whether that be a public park or someone's back garden, and they share that food with the owner of the land but also with others. And Fallen Fruit have provided Food Cloud with fresh food for the past 2 years on the basis of that. So connecting up with other food sharing activities. What you can see here is some of the information that Food Cloud have gathered themselves. Similarly to the global picture, what we have in Ireland is 1 in 8 people who experience food poverty, which means that they spend a disproportionate amount of their income simply to stop hunger. But at the same time, Ireland produces more than 1 million tonnes of food thrown out every year from consumers and business alike, costing on average, it's estimated, around €700 per person every year. Their idea was to use technology to connect those with food, the retailers, with those who are in need. In this case, it's a business to charity app, so they don't deal with the individual people experiencing food poverty, they deal with the charities that provide food for those people who are hungry. And the idea is that the technology allows this to happen in a seamless, efficient way. And this is important. They've been very successful, as it indicates from their website, these images here. They've redistributed more than 7,000 tonnes of food, which has generated, it's estimated, more than 7,000 tonnes of CO2 saved, more than 5 million meals have been redistributed, and more than 2,000 tonnes of food has been redistributed across the island of Ireland. But this doesn't tell the full picture. I think the metrics are useful in terms of reporting, particularly to funders in this case, but what they don't show is the common ground that was needed to establish the activities and relationships which makes Food Cloud work, both for the retailers and for those in need of food. So the technology is important, but it alone didn't set up the social relations. In interviews that we've conducted with Food Cloud subsequently, what's been clear is that without the social relations, without the face-to-face interactions between Food Cloud and the retailers, and between Food Cloud and the charities, things just wouldn't work. So the tech is an enabler, but it's alone insufficient to create the kinds of relations that are required to ensure that food can be redistributed seamlessly. So the technology is important, as indicated by these quotes from Food Cloud, which are talking about coming together, which talk about meeting of minds between the commercial operator, about understanding what Food Cloud is about and what they seek to do, and also Food Cloud understanding what drives retailers, for-profit retailers who have a responsibility to their shareholders. Equally, it indicated the relationships which will need to be built by Food Cloud with other actors. So, for example, in order to rescue food, because a number of charities didn't have the physical ability to move and collect food from the retailers, to actually bring those actors together. So it's around working with ESB. In this case, they got some electric vehicles, so they were keen to ensure their sustainability credentials were around the collection and redistribution of food, paid heed to sustainability criteria, so low carbon emissions from that, but also through insurance, so getting companies to buy into the very concept of food sharing. But equally in terms of those people who were receiving food and the charities and the volunteers who helped in that redistribution. So these are some quotes here from a number of volunteers who work with Food Cloud. Here we have a housing association, a charity that says that the Food Cloud and Tesco initiative has made a difference to the residents in many ways. So the food brings women who live with us together, so it brings the people who are working in this housing association together. It assists not only in economic terms, but also in terms of creating social capacity, social capital, if you like, the way in which community cohesion can be built. The Bellina St Vincent de Paul charity here talks about how the process has built skills into the idea of helping people understand what it takes to grow food and to consume surplus food in this way, but also in terms of the very emotional experiences that volunteers get through interacting with people in need of food and how moving and driving that can be. And going back to my earlier example around the importance of common ground or non-human nature, this quote from a Food Cloud volunteer at the bottom kind of indicates how people feel that this psychological well-being shouldn't be underestimated in terms of being involved in these kinds of initiatives. So being part of something that's bigger than you, having a connection with what it is to be human. And I understood that while Plymouth doesn't feature in the Scarcity 100 database, there are examples in the vicinity where this kind of food sharing is taking place. And I noticed just in the cafe in the Students' Union here, the Plymouth Food Bank is collecting for food in that site. But what's interesting here is also the Tamar Grow Share Cook initiative, which is again working with people on lower incomes to provide healthy eating and cookery skills for people, to enable people to address issues around food poverty and accessibility of fresh food through growing, sharing and cooking. But I think it's important to recognise that it's not simply, food sharing isn't simply for those in dire need, it's not simply for those on low incomes. There's a whole way in which other aspects of food sharing, whether it's foraging, whether it's gleaning, whether it's about coming together to share meal experiences, whether it's through integration around migrants coming, refugees in local places, what we've seen. I've got researchers out in the field currently in Melbourne, in London, in Athens, where they're looking at these kinds of activities where it's an attempt to build community relations between distant strangers in particular locations. So there's much to be done here, and much of my examples have been focused on the local, the backyard, the household. But the issues of common ground have much broader implications. So there's a multi-scalar attention to the notion of creating common ground. And the Common Ground Initiative was launched by Ban Ki-moon in this summer, 2016. And his argument was that we are stronger together. And this initiative was a landmark of its kind. So it was the bringing together of the 6 major advertising and communications marketing organisations who committed themselves to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is effectively the post-2015 development agenda, which is trying to set up to meet targets for 2030, and there's a whole bunch of targets around these Sustainable Development Goals. But this initiative was to get together multinational corporations who traditionally would be in competition to come together to work in unity around addressing a particular sustainable development goal. And the argument here from this quote from Ban Ki-moon says, "Today the communications industry is taking a historic first of its kind step to beat poverty, injustice and inequality." They're coming together to say what was an impossible task. Differences aside, in support of a joint, unique and exciting initiative to advance the Sustainable Development Goals, an example and a challenge to all of us to find our own common ground for the common good. Now, there are multiple issues with this. We don't really know what's going on. Some of the money was put up was for an advertising campaign, which is kind of indicated here. My concerns with that relate to the concerns I mentioned briefly earlier around the efficacy of providing information about these mass media campaigns, about what difference that actually makes. Now clearly you could say advertising and communications is important. It affects what we buy on a daily basis around consumption. But there are many more and more intractable tasks to be felt at a global scale in terms of reducing unsustainable consumption. And I think that those things need to be borne in mind. And I will look with great interest to see what actually emerges from this Common Ground initiative held at that kind of global scale. But finally, in terms of the importance of geography, I think what's clear and what runs through all of my examples that I've mentioned this evening is that geographers are uniquely placed to be able to bring together different ideas, to be outward facing to multiple disciplines which are needed in order to address some of the most intractable sustainability goals. So it's incredibly important that geographers who are both literate and numerate, so they have skills which can speak to natural sciences and social sciences, to the humanities and to engineering, are there as a kind of bridging glue to assist in bridging the silos of specialist information, which is absolutely necessary, but interdisciplinary silos will not address the meta-societal challenges around everyday practices, around everyday environments. And so geographers, I think, are uniquely placed relative to any other discipline to be able to play that function in a transdisciplinary role, which we are looking forward to in the future. And I just want to end with this quote from a book which is also called Common Ground, which came out last year. It's a fabulous book set, it's kind of a fictional autobiography, I think. But it's about someone who grew up in the 1980s in a kind of edgeland, which, similar to myself, grew up in Essex, in an area which had been the site of much extractive industry around mining during the 19th and 20th centuries, which had effectively become a kind of wasteland, an urban fringe, a kind of no man's land. And how that value through nature recolonising these kind of urban rural fringes was incredibly important to him, and also I felt it was a useful and apposite way to end this lecture. He says the enmeshed borders where human and nature collide are microcosms of our world at large, an extraordinary, exquisite world that's growing closer to the edge every day. These spaces reassert a vital truth. Nature isn't just some remote mountainous protected park, it's all around us, it's in us, it is us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Knock myself over to start with an extra step there. Thank you very much indeed, Anna, for some really thought-provoking ideas around one of the most important themes about thinking about sustainable living and sustainable societies, and for bearing with us during the course of our minor interruption. This is the point where we normally say, well, we've got lots of time for questions. Well, because maybe a little bit truncated on that compared with what we normally are, but I wouldn't want to deny the opportunity for people to ask Anna any questions they may have about this particular talk or about the wider research. So any questions from the audience, please? Jeff?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Anna, for an excellent talk. Could you just go back to your mention for 100 cities and I think it was the Share Cities project?
Yeah.
One thing that is striking about that one, and I think that depends a bit on the methodologies you've chosen, is the absence of large sharing networks within developing countries. I mean, there's really kind of a bias towards advanced economies. I mean, I guess this is linked to the issue that you use largely internet to find information. But of course, one key argument that could be made is that the most sharing economies and societies and communities in the world, traditionally at least, have been developing countries where food sharing is an important part of survival in these communities. But of course, it's informal, so it's not as formalized as your project is kind of focusing on. So, I mean, is what you're doing in this project and others actually about the rediscovery of these, lost food connections in this case?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the whole project is focused entirely on ICT-mediated food sharing, precisely, as you mentioned, because the notion of technology is allowing people to revisit notions of sharing in new ways, across new spaces, across new scales. So that's what I'm particularly interested in. And as a result, the Sharing Cities network, which is a global network, is predominantly from the global north because of that ICT dimension to it. But you're absolutely right. Historically, it's been very much studied by anthropologists around what sharing means and what food sharing means, particularly evolutionary biologists in terms of species, non-human species. I guess in terms of the global north and the Western countries from where the research emerged, it was also a reaction, as I say, from the co-created workshops which created the visions around a more collaborative environment for food sharing, was this kind of feeling that we'd lost something by not sharing food, by not sharing the experience of growing together, by not sharing the experience of cooking together or eating together. So like you say, finding again ways in which we can build communities, the atomization of eating moments through the TV dinner or through the kind of eating on the run meant that in certain societies, not all, because particularly within Europe, say for example, Italy and France still maintain a very strong tradition of the family meal. But in other societies, like the UK and the United States in particular, we've seen this kind of notion of eating together really declining, and there's a concern around that. So yes, I think that you're right with your observation. Yeah.
Yes.
Does building design play into that? Because if you look at modern developments, you find no space for a dining room table, for instance. So how would families celebrate eating together? We're lucky we do. But how do families compensate when they don't have that space?
Yeah, no, that's the point. But then, of course, what people were envisaging was that actually there'd be more communal dining, that particularly around high-density urban living, because the focus on cities here, of course, we know that already more than 50% of the world's population live in cities, and that's predicted to increase to 80% by 2050. So in that case, people were imagining much more intensive high-rise living where there would be much more opportunities around the communal sites. Now, how we get from where we are now to there is a very intractable question. I mean, I know I lived myself in an apartment for many years, and all the communal spaces were shut down because of antisocial behaviour. So we couldn't even, there was a space for even a tennis court, which was completely derelict because people were climbing in and they couldn't get insurance to cover public liability and stuff like that. So I mean, it's not that it's easy to do, but there seemed to be this kind of latent interest in doing it. But a lot of people, what we said when we worked with organisations like Procter & Gamble and Marks & Spencer when we were doing the consensus home labs, and what they said to us is multinational corporations was that in surveys, everybody says they want more sustainable food and more sustainable products, but when we make them and put them on the shelves, people don't buy them. So they're like, how do we deal with this? How do we get to say more sustainable stuff? Was their question to us. And I think, that goes back to the notion of providing the infrastructures around that. There needs to be new social ways of looking at things, but also the infrastructures, technologies, regulation, which help support those kinds of activities.
Yes.
On the matter of evaluating intangibles, I'm coming to the earlier part, talking about the earlier part of your lecture. Things like trees, open space, that kind of thing. Do planners have some means of scoring which they can apply, and is it a system that is used? So you can judge open space values against road development, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I have to say that I'm not entirely familiar with the state of the art in British planning currently. My PhD was looking at environmental values and the planning system in the UK. That was back in the 1990s, so things have probably changed quite a bit. But what was clear from that research was that there's professional judgment by planners. So there's expert, either landscape architects who have some notion of different landscape characteristics and values. We also know that there are systems of listing, particularly historic or heritage forms, and there are designations. So they tend to use these kind of professional judgment ideas. Very difficult to get these kind of community environmental values to be incorporated unless there's a kind of collective approach. I think this was Common Ground's perspective, was the idea is that you build a groundswell of support, because one individual is saying, hang on, that's parked where I walk my dog and it's really important to me, doesn't really cut much sway, particularly in the face of these professional interests. But if you have a large number of people coming together and articulating an agreed kind of vision or stating values for a particular area being important from a community value, then that is more likely to sway or be taken into account. But there's absolutely no kind of quantification of those kinds of qualities. It's more based on notions of expert judgment, I believe. It's probably still.
Yeah, I've had quite a lot of dealings with the British planning system over the course of the last couple of years with another kind of quite personal project, and I can vouch fairly safely that the idea of professional judgment, and in many cases deciding on behalf of local communities what is valued relative to what is valued by central government or local government, is still kind of the predominant way of doing things. On a lot of issues, there's a kind of a minority of factors which are seen to be quantifiable in those sorts of more productive type of ways. But most of it comes down to, and often an individual judgment, not necessarily a collective judgment by a team of people involved in planning, but actually ultimately a single decision point.
And I think that there are different stages where it's easier to involve more of a collective vision, which is around kind of forward planning stage, so development plans rather than development control. So when you quote from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it's very much on the development control end, where it is in that case of something, a development is being proposed, which people then complain about or react to. And I think in the development forward planning space, you could be much more visionary, much more positive, and you're more likely to get people involved in that process. But there has to be this notion of outreach. If people don't feel comfortable generally, if they don't have familiarity with the planning system, or I don't know, that's not for me, I can't say anything, what will they do, I don't have anything to say. But if you provide environments where they feel comfortable to articulate their kind of concerns, which is what Common Ground is trying to do through the Parish Maps project, through local distinctiveness and these other activities, then I think people are basically being asked, well, what's important to you? And everyone knows that, even if they're not usually asked it.
Okay. Time for one or two more questions before we adjourn to the wine section.
Come on, let's go get a drink.
Because I'm going to ask a question if nobody else does.
Go on in.
Yeah, because I was particularly struck by this idea of the intermediaries, the researcher as intermediaries, and presumably the kind of the whole notion of this is a kind of a catalytic point. And then it becomes spontaneous through the technologies, through the development and all those sort of things. And I just wondered kind of how messages, or if there is actually any research which kind of looks at those kind of messages and ideas that are generated by the intermediaries to begin with, how when this process does become spontaneous, how those messages change, the emphases on what is seen as sustainable food or sustainable food practices change. And it kind of struck me there was also a bit of a parallel there with the whole idea of ecosystem services. It had an original concept there, and then of course it gets applied into lots of different contexts and gets interpreted by planners, by economists, by politicians, by business leaders, and so on and so forth. And kind of there's a huge amount of potential for what the idea of ecosystem services is and what it's trying to achieve, morphing, perhaps distorting. I mean, has there been has your work so far been able to kind of trace those translation and modification processes at all?
Well, I mean, this is the challenge, isn't it? With you get funded for projects which are delimited in time, even though the consensus project was a long time, the home labs were right at the end of that. So you generally find it difficult to do those kind of longitudinal studies in the modern funding environment. We were lucky enough to get funding from the Environmental Protection Agency to do that. The danger was that they really wanted us to come up with something that they could just lift up and apply at kind of national level. So they would think, oh, how are we going to apply home labs across Ireland? But that really wasn't the purpose of the project. It was to look at the ways in which rules, tools, skills and understandings come together to shape what we do and why. So in terms of what you are suggesting, our kind of recommendations to the Environmental Protection Agency were around needing to build relations of trust with communities through trusted intermediaries. In the case, we were considered to be independent researchers, so we weren't affiliated with large-scale multinationals or indeed with policy, if you like. So I mean, some of those kinds of organisations, maybe grassroots sustainability organisations, community organisations, provide that kind of trusted intermediary, but of course trust isn't fixed or enduring necessarily, so it's a kind of fragile, ongoing negotiation around that. And the other thing I'd comment on in relation to your question is just in terms of kind of embeddedness of activities and habitual behaviour. I mean, I think that what we wanted to do was to get people to try something, even if they were initially reluctant, because then if you do certain things a number of times and you have the support to do it, it can become habitual, which means that you have shifted your behaviours. And consumption behaviours have changed dramatically over the last 100 years and will continue to change, affected by lots of interventions, both deliberate and otherwise, around how we live. And we've seen that through technologies. And that's where the food sharing kind of idea came from as well.
So a lot of parallels with the transition towns and that kind of modification.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think probably wine and or home beckon at this point in proceedings. There's a little reception outside. So I'd just like to close proceedings again tonight by thanking everybody for coming along this evening to hear Anna speak for the latest of the Mark Blacksell Lecture Series, and also especially to Anna herself for making the journey and giving us such an insightful, invigorating and thought-provoking talk. So thank you very much again indeed.
Thank you.